Hello and welcome to the first lesson on the unit called Social Influence. Before you start this lesson, you should look at the specification for social influence. It should be on either Moodle or MS Teams in the social psychology or social influence folder, and it will be labelled SP00, and have a look at the specification in full. So this is the first lesson for social influence, and it covers the first two parts of the specification called types of conformity and explanations of conformity. So what does it mean if you conform? Pause the video here and just think about that word. What does it mean if you conform? And hopefully you've given that some thought. Conforming is when you want to fit in with a majority. So really important words for this are majority and fitting in, because conformity isn't where your behaviour changes because somebody tells you what to do. Conforming means that you look at the majority of people around you and fit in with what they are doing. So pause the video again. Can you think of some examples of conforming? And if you're stuck, think about peer pressure, because that's really what conformity is. Peer pressure where you're not told to do anything, but everybody else is doing the same thing. So hopefully you've identified some areas of conformity. It tends to be things like perhaps smoking or drinking alcohol or taking drugs. Those are common things that are related to peer pressure. But it also includes things like the makeup that you might wear, the clothes you're wearing, the music you're listening to, the food that you're eating. Anything where there's a group of people around you all doing the same thing, and then you change your behaviour to fit in with what they're doing. So in the unit social influence, we look at conformity, and the way that they define it is a form of social influence that results from exposure to the majority position and leads to compliance within that position. So it's the tendency for people to adopt the behaviour, attitudes and values of other people around them. So can you think of some behaviours, attitudes and values that people may adopt when they conform to the majority? So I'd like you to use handout SP01, which you can find on Moodle or MS Teams. Have a look at page 2, and there's a space there for you to write down some of the examples, and you might want to use some of the examples you thought of before. So it's behaviours, so what people are actually doing, their attitudes, so what they feel about something, and their values as well. So values being what you hold as important to you. So have a go at filling in some of those. And when you've done that, then the next part is to look at the 3 different types of conformity. So number 1 on the specification says types of conformity, and there are 3 types. They range from the most superficial level, which means like the most shallowest form of conformity, to the deepest level. So the 3 types, as you can see here, are compliance, identification and internalization. And compliance is the most superficial level, because if you comply with somebody or not, sorry about that. If you comply with a majority, then that means that you go along with what they are doing, but you're only doing it while you're with them. And we will often use that people will change their behaviour and attitudes publicly, but not privately. So if you comply, if there's compliance that is going on, then it's very short-lived, because you're only going to change your behaviour, attitudes or values while you're with that majority. And once you leave them, so publicly it looks like you're agreeing with them, but once you leave them, then your private views remain the same and you'll probably change your behaviour back. The second level of conformity, the middle level, is identification. And that is between superficial and the deepest level. That's the kind of middle level. And so the way we describe this is say that you change your behaviour publicly and privately but only for a temporary time. So if you identify with a certain group, so supposing you might have joined a sports team, or some other examples might be an exercise group, or the army cadets or something like that, or when you were young, maybe you joined the Cubs or the Brownies. While you're in that group, you identify with that group completely. If you think about it, you're all in with what they're doing. So you've got that your behaviour has changed publicly, and when you leave the group, it's also changed. So it's changed privately, but it's only for a temporary amount of time while you're in that particular group. So once you leave the group, then your behaviour may revert back to the way you were before. So identification is identifying with the group, changing your behaviour publicly and privately, but only for a limited amount of time while you're in that group. And the third type of conformity is the deepest level, and that is internalization. So this is the deepest level, and the way we describe it is to say that you change your behaviours, attitudes and values publicly and privately, and it's a permanent change. So this means you've been exposed to a majority view about something, and you've thought deeply about this, and you've probably found out all sorts of information about it until in the end you have internalized whatever it might be, so that it is truly a part of who you are forever. So although this might start off as conformity to the majority, it's internalized, and that becomes a permanent change. So it often happens with things like religion, and you might have heard about people having perhaps a religious conversion. Conversion is a word we use with internalization, because you have converted to that way of thinking, and it tends to be forever. It could be, so as I said, a religion or a spirituality, or it could be a voting pattern of behaviour. It tends to be that that will remain with you forever. So very quickly, here's just some examples. So the first one, that superficial level of compliance. Supposing somebody says a joke that you don't find funny, but everybody else is laughing and you laugh along with it, that's a good example of compliance, where you're just fitting in with everyone publicly but not privately. And here's an example of the second one, that identification level. You agree publicly and privately. So you can see these army cadets here, the people in that picture, that majority there, they're all in publicly and privately, but once they leave that group, then their behaviour may change. And as I said, with internalisation, it's that deep and permanent change, and it tends to be things like voting behaviours or perhaps religion or spirituality. So go back to your examples of the attitudes, behaviours and values that you identified on page 2 of handout SPO1, and write next to each example whether it's likely to be compliance, identification or internalisation. And for some of them you could argue it's on 1 or 2 levels, but just go through and have a look and see whether what you've written down would be compliance, identification or internalisation. So that covers what we've done there. It has covered the AO1, the description content for the types of conformity. What we're looking at now is number 2 on the specification, and it's the AO1, as in the description of explanations of why people conform. And Insco et al. In 1985 gave 2 explanations for conformity, and they are normative social influence and informational social influence. And in my experience, people go, oh yeah, normative, informational, but they quickly forget those terms because they're new terms. So pause the video, go and tell someone around you that there are 2 explanations of conformity, and tell them it's normative social influence and informational social influence, and tell them you'll explain it later. And then write it down in your handwriting, in big handwriting. The 2 explanations for conformity are normative social influence and informational social influence. So pause the video and go for it. So welcome back. Let's have a look at what those explanations say. So normative social influence means that you conform to be liked. And as humans, we have this desire to fit in, we crave social companionship, we fear rejection, and people who behave differently from the norm, from the majority, stand out and are at risk of being cast out of the group. So have a look at that picture there. There's the majority of people behind her all having the same opinion. She thinks differently, and suddenly you can see that she's not included in the group, and you can see that she's not happy about that. So this explanation says that some people might conform simply to be liked. And if you have a look at this picture, you can see that woman there, and she's thinking privately, I don't want to drink this. But the majority of people around her are drinking alcohol, and they're having the same kind of alcoholic drinks. And so she is fitting in with the majority just so that she doesn't stand out and is different. And this is an example of a very superficial level of conformity, because if that woman is thinking privately, I don't want to drink this, then when she leaves that group, then she'll revert to her ordinary behaviour and maybe have a cup of tea or a Diet Coke or whatever it is that she likes to drink normally. So this type of conformity is compliance. So the explanation is normative social influence, and it goes with compliance because you are only agreeing on a public level to be liked, but privately you revert to your own behaviour. And I've put there, given what you've just learned, what condition do you think is important for normative social influence to occur? So what do you think has to be there for somebody to actually comply and show the normative social influence? So pause the video, have a little think. And hopefully you've thought about that there needs to be a majority watching them in order for them to do that behaviour. So as soon as the majority isn't there surveying what they're doing, watching what they're doing, then they will revert back to normal behaviour for them. The second explanation of why people conform is informational social influence, and this means that you are conforming to be right. And so in society, in life, we don't want to look stupid, we don't want to appear foolish, we want to be confident in what we're saying, and therefore we might go along with people because we genuinely think they're right. So we don't just comply in behaviour alone, but we change our point of view in line with those majority who are doing the influencing. So this involves changing both private and public attitudes and behaviours. So it's a deeper level of conformity. It's probably going to be internalisation. You could argue at the very least it's identification, but go with internalisation. It's saying we've changed our behaviours to be right. So if you look at this picture here, this is the current president of the United States. Think of that what you will. If somebody had voted for Donald Trump to get into presidency, they will change their views and behaviour to fit in with his because they genuinely think that what he's saying is right. When actually, when you look at some of his views, for example, on climate change, they're completely wrong according to scientific evidence. But people will therefore think that everything that he is saying is correct. And so they are going to internalise that political view, and they will change permanently because they think that person or that majority is right. So for informational social influence to occur, there are three things that are most likely for social influence to occur, and that's when the situation is ambiguous, so the right course of action is not clear, the situation is a crisis, so rapid action is required, and when we think other people are experts, so we believe that others know exactly what they're doing. And there's a picture there of when the 9/11 crisis, so you may be aware that in 2001 there was a terrorist attack on the Twin Towers in America. And so when that was going on, obviously there was huge confusion. It was a very obviously a terrible, terrible situation, but it was ambiguous. The people in it just didn't know what was going on. They didn't know what to do. It was a crisis. And so if there was a majority following experts, so if they saw like the fire brigade, then that fire brigade are going to be a majority who are the experts, and they're going to follow what that fire brigade are doing. So although there's only one fireman there, imagine that there's a team of firefighters, obviously men and women, and that if you saw that majority, you would follow them and you would follow their lead immediately because you believe that they are right. So A good activity to do for this is to create a summary poster of the types of conformity with your own examples. If you do this now, it's as though you're creating your own revision materials as you go along. So I highly recommend you take the time to do this. So create something. I'm a very visual learner myself. I'd have it in particular colours and probably put a little image, either draw one or print one out, to show the different types of conformity, which you know to be compliance, identification and internalisation, and put an example, either your own or the ones in this video. And then also create a summary poster of the explanations for conformity, which we know are normative social influence and informational social influence, and again, use examples. So if you do that now, if you spend that time now doing that, that will help consolidate your knowledge for the description of these things, the AO1 material, and it will be good consolidation and revision. So I've put here the assessment objectives. I've just mentioned the I keep saying AO1, that means assessment objective 1. If you ever see that, in my lessons it will tend to be in light blue, and it means that you're going to outline or describe a theory, you're going to explain a theory. Down the bottom you can see pale green, that's AO3, assessment objective 3, which is evaluate, which we're going to come on to in a moment for this. Evaluate means that once you've described your theory, you need to provide strengths and weaknesses of that theory and perhaps real world applications. And you get as many marks for evaluation as you do for the outlining of the theory in the first place. And evaluation is what most people don't do or forget. And so they're really limiting themselves in the exams. AO2 is apply your knowledge. That means they'll give you a stimulus in the exam, and then you don't describe the theory, you apply your knowledge of the theory to answer the question. Okay, so we're going to now look at the evaluation of types of conformity, types and explanations of conformity. And so these evaluation points can be used specifically for normative social influence and informational social influence, because those are the explanations of conformity. But you can also use it for the types of conformity as well. So this first evaluation point, when you're evaluating, if you've got a 12-mark essay, and if you had a 12-mark essay that was a straight set question, outline and evaluate 2 explanations for conformity, then the AO1 is explaining and describing normative social influence and informational social influence and using the right terminology, so using the words of compliance and internalisation. When it comes to evaluation, you get 6 marks for evaluation, and I always think generally it's about 2 marks per evaluation point. So you're looking probably for 3 evaluation points, and you need to make sure they're in distinct paragraphs to make that easy for the examiner to mark, and introduce each evaluation point with whether that's going to be criticism of the theory or support for the theory or perhaps a real-world application of the theory. So for this evaluation point, you would start it by saying there is research support for normative social influence, and this is a study that was done by Lincolnback and Perkins. Now, you don't need to remember the names if you don't want to. You only have to remember names that are on the specification. But sometimes people remember them. If you do, that's fine. So Lincolnback and Perkins in 2003 used normative social influence to create an anti-smoking campaign in a college. And they put up posters. If you look on the right, you can see a picture of a poster. It says, most ETHS, and that's the name of the college, most ETHS students don't smoke cigarettes, and it gives you a figure, 4 out of 5 students don't smoke. So if you look at that poster, it's got a majority there, there's 4 people. It's telling you that, it's not telling you what to do. It's not a poster saying, don't smoke, it's bad for you. Don't smoke, it will give you lung disease. Don't smoke, it will give you heart disease. That poster is not telling you what to do. What it's doing is using a normative message to tell you what everybody else is doing. So it's creating a majority for you. So most ETHS students believe that smoking cigarettes is harmful, and 4 out of 5 don't smoke. So this is a normative message, and the evaluation point is to say this is research to support normative social influence, because Lincolnback and Perkins found that from this campaign that most students therefore didn't smoke. So it was an anti-smoking campaign that was using a normative message and it was a successful one. So this is showing you that normative social influence can be used for good. If you tell them, a person what the majority of their peers are doing, and then they want to fit in with their peers, then they are being influenced by the majority in a good way. The next piece of evidence to support normative social influence is research by somebody called Schultz. It's spelled Schultz. And again, you don't have to remember that name, but I remember it because I imagine Schultz is like a superhero. And if you imagine Superman, he's got a big S on his outfit. And I imagine Schultz is standing there like a superhero, and he's got S on his outfit for Schultz. But instead of a cape flying out behind him, he's got a towel hanging out behind him, flying out behind him. And I call him Towel Man because Schultz was a researcher who was interested in the environment. And so in my mind, he's a superhero because he's trying to save the environment. So he did some research in a hotel, and it was a field experiment because they went to a real hotel, but they controlled the independent and dependent variable. So the independent variable in the hotel was that half the guests got a message on a door hanger that said, please reuse your towels, protect the environment, and it gave them an environmental message and encouraged them to reuse their towels. And the other half of the guests got exactly the same environmental message, but at the bottom of it, they also got the normative message. 75% of guests reuse their towels at this hotel. And so they wanted to see if there was a difference in whether people got an environmental message or an environmental message plus a normative message, to see whether that would influence how much towel reuse there was. So I've put a couple of questions there. Identify the normative message. So the normative message is 75% of guests reuse their towels. It says what happened. So pause the video. What do you think happened? Which group do you think reuse their towels more and why? And hopefully you've identified that the ones who got the normative message increased their towel use more, and they did. So they wanted, and the reason is because they wanted to fit in with what all the other guests were doing. I have put what type of conformity is this. So if you are just fitting in to be liked and to do what everyone else is doing, that is normative social influence. So it's compliance. So there are the results. So 75% of so the normative message was 75% of guests reused their towels, and then the findings were that there was 25% increase in towel reuse by the people who had the normative message. And so I find those figures quite helpful because 75% plus 25% is 100%. So that's how it sticks in my mind. And if you want to, you can look at those research methods questions there as well. So that was the hypothesis. If you did that research methods task, guests who have the normative message will reuse their towels more than guests who don't have the normative message. Okay, so the next piece of evaluation is for research support for informational social influence. So Wittenbrink and Henley in 1996 did an investigation, did an experiment. So it was they gave exposure to other people's beliefs has an influence on social stereotypes. That's what they found. And it can explain, unfortunately, things like racist views. So the participants who took part were exposed to negative comparison information about African Americans, which they were led to believe was the view of the majority. They later reported more negative beliefs about a Black individual. So the participants believed that the majority were right. They were led to believe those were experts in the field, and then they changed their values and beliefs in line with those. So it shows how people can change their attitudes and values through exposure to a majority view that they think is right. You might want to try those research methods practice questions. Okay, so the last piece of research for informational social influence is about how other people's reactions can influence you. So if you look at these reactions here, from these GIFs. You can see the top one, the woman is shocked, the people around her are shocked and surprised, and not in a good way. And then the majority underneath, the guy in the foreground clearly has great faith in what the person is saying or what he's looking at, and the majority around him are all applauding and they're nodding along. So I've said, why does this link to informational social influence? So pause the video and have a think about that. And welcome back. So this is about that sometimes, like with informational social influence, it's not necessarily what people are saying, but sometimes what they're doing that will influence you. So even if you see the majority view in terms of people's reactions, that can influence you. And I want you to have a think about presidential elections. So at the moment, those are actually going on as I'm recording this video. So at the moment, it's Trump versus Biden. And before COVID, the presidential election candidates would go to huge stadiums and give speeches, and there would be huge reactions from the crowd, most people positively, especially with Trump, because he ejected people who were against him. So Fine Natal in 2007, they used this idea of presidential debates because they found that the judgment of candidate performance in US presidential debates could be influenced by the knowledge of others' reactions. So participants saw supposedly the reaction of their fellow participants on screen during a presidential debate, and that caused large shifts in participants' beliefs of the candidate's performance. So there were participants, because they were in an experiment, they were led to believe that they were looking at the reactions of the crowd in presidential debates, and that changed and shifted their view alongside the reactions of the other people. So this was because they believed that that majority were right, and they changed their beliefs and values alongside. Okay, so we're nearly there. The last evaluation point, and by the way, if you are an AS student, you don't have to remember all of these evaluation points. There's enough information here for a 16-mark essay, but you will only be required to do 12-mark essays. And what I would do if I was you is I'd pick one evidence of normative social influence, one evidence of informational social evidence, because I gave you two of each. Just choose one of each that sticks in your mind more. And then this evaluation point is a good way to finish an essay about explanations, because this is a criticism of the theory of informational social influence. And this is the only criticism. So your essay should be balanced. So you should have evidence for it and criticisms of the theory. So this one says the informational social influence is moderated by the type of task that you're being asked to do. So have a look at this dude here, this guy here, he's called Brock. Imagine he's just moved to Ludlow from New York, where he grew up, and he's super cool and he's really nice and everyone gets on with him, and he's in your class at college. He's made loads of new friends. Everyone's been having banter all day. All the Ludlow students have been telling him things like Ludlow's the capital of England, and Brock has been checking all the facts on his phone to check what they said. And he's also been telling them some untrue things like New York has the highest percentage of bears in the UK. So later on in class, the teacher asks everybody which city is in England is most highly populated, Ludlow or London. All of Brock's friends say Ludlow because they want to have a laugh with Brock and make him look foolish, but not in a bad way. There's no bullying going on. But Brock checks his phone and answers London. What would informational social influence dictate Brock would say? What should Brock have said according to the theory of informational social influence? And I can hear you loud and clear. Yes, he should have said Ludlow, because all of his friends were saying that, and his friends have lived in Ludlow and they know about Ludlow. So he should have said Ludlow. What did Brock say? He said London, but why? Why did he say London? Why didn't he say Ludlow? And the very simple answer is he could check the information on his phone. So this evaluation point is saying that if informational social influence says you conform to be right, then it's moderated by the type of task. Because if the type of task is objective, as in you're being asked a question about whether Ludlow or London is the most highly populated, we can check the facts. It's an objective, factual piece of information, and therefore he's not going to conform to be right because he can check the facts on his phone. However, if the task was based not in physical reality, so not an objective task, if it was based on something subjective, like your own opinion, like what's the funnest place in the UK? Is it Ludlow or London? Well, that is purely depends on your opinion, because it depends on what sort of person you are. So you would conform if the task was subjective, like what's the funnest place in the UK, but you wouldn't conform to be right on objective factual information like what's most highly populated. So this criticises the theory, saying you're not just going to conform, we're not just going to see informational social influence every time, because if people are conforming to be right, then if they can check the facts, then they don't need to conform to be right. Okay, so there is a stretch and challenge question there. It's an application of knowledge question. So you can pause the video, have a read of that and answer those questions. And you can, if you want to, you can test yourself or other people on the evaluation to do with the details of the studies. Perkins' smoking study, Schultz's towel study, Wittenbrink and Henley's study about racial stereotypes, Feinertel's study about how people's reactions in presidential debates influenced you, and how the type of task moderates informational social influence but not normative social influence. And if you want, you can summarise those about like 3 evaluation points on a poster. You can also try some stretch and challenge research methods. So pause the video and try those. And directed study will be on MS Teams. So not assessed is complete all the work in the SPO1 handout, and there will be a timed essay, outline and evaluate normative and informational social influence, explanations of conformity. And there is a model essay, since this is the first one you've done, there's a model essay which you can find on MS Teams and Moodle in the social influence section, and it's referenced SP19A.